Thanks so much, everybody, for joining in for this conversation. We'll get started in a minute or two. There are a couple more people still coming in. Thank you. Rookie mistake, I was muted. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Abramson. I'm a senior fellow at the Arms Control Association, and I also lead the Forum on the Arms Trade. We are delighted to welcome you to this conversation. I'll give a quick little introduction to the conversation and tell you how the technology is going to work, and then we'll begin. The July 26th ouster of the democratically elected president of Niger by the military forces, some of whom have been trained by the United States, has brought attention to how the United States provides arms, training, and other security assistance to the country. A country that recently was praised as a democracy success, and in which the United States and other countries base many forces. What we can learn about U.S. security assistance and training is the focus of the webinar today. Of course, for the people of Niger, their issues are not learning from this experience. Their issues are surviving now in this situation, living their day-to-day, understanding what to do, and dealing with a dynamic situation as ECOWAS and others are taking steps or threatening to take steps. In the news today, obviously, the junta has said they're going to charge the former president, the captured president, with high treason. So this is a developing situation, and what should be done for the people of Niger, the region where there are implications and by the US and others is not the core focus of this conversation, nor are the people who are panelists here today representing the voices of Africa. We want to be sort of clear that we're talking about what we can learn and what the United States should learn from this moving forward, because unfortunately coups such as this are becoming more common. Public attention to moments of crisis such as this tend to be fleeting, and it's unclear that we are learning the lessons we need to so that we are not contributing to these happening again in the future. So with that as a frame, I am really delighted to welcome the panelists, because I personally also need to be very humble in that I am not at all an Africa expert. So I am looking forward to the conversations and the input that we are going to receive. As a bit of how this will work, the people who are attending the meeting in Zoom, you are free to use the chat to talk amongst yourselves, but please put your questions in the Q&A. We'll be looking at the Q&A for the questions. You should be able to actually upvote things in the Q&A, so you can find if there's something really asked there that you think is really great, please do help us pick that as a question to ask. We're going to start with a couple of rounds with the panelists. I'll introduce the panelists one at a time and give them a question, and then we'll come back around and we'll go from there. At the end, I'll ask you to take a survey, but thanks so much for joining in on this really timely conversation as we are watching the news and really don't know exactly what will happen, and hope for the best for the people of Niger as the situation seems to potentially be deteriorating. The first panelist is Nick Turse, who I'm really delighted to welcome, and I didn't give any of our panelists a chance to review what I was going to say in terms of their bio, so they might want to correct me as I go. But he is a contributing writer for The Intercept, reporting on national security and foreign policy, and has written for the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and many other publications. He's also published a number of books looking at Africa in particular, including conflict there, as well as the US role in that. And he has received the Rittenhouse Prize for Investigative Reporting, a James Arneson Award for Social Justice Journalism, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. I imagine many of you have seen some of his recent reporting, not just on Niger, but other parts of Africa, where he has been trying to figure out where the U.S. has been involved. There's been, anyway, I should stop there, Nick. I'm going to turn it over to you and to sort of frame a question for you. This is not the first place where U.S. trained forces have been involved in military takeovers of governments. Can you share a bit about the history of these and what you have found in your investigations? And I've asked all the panelists to make sort of introductory remarks for about 5 minutes. So thanks a bunch, Nick. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to thank you for having me on this really illustrious panel. And, it's great to be here today. I just want to emphasize that I'm not an expert on Niger. I cover the U.S. military in Africa, but I have reported from the region before, and I regularly report on what the U.S. military is doing. So, I think to start, there's a long, rich history of the United States backing coups and supporting juntas globally. But I'm going to talk about West Africa and the Sahel during the War on Terror. I have a new article on the way with some revised numbers. All told, I've found that at least 15 U.S. supported officers have been involved in 12 coups in West Africa and the Greater Sahel in recent years, basically since 2008. But I want to run through a quick history so my comments don't come off as reductive and our audience understands that I'm reporting on correlations, not necessarily causation. I think to understand all these coups, we need to go back to just after the 9/11 attacks. The United States went looking for terrorists around the world. It actually had a hard time finding them in sub-Saharan Africa. It couldn't identify even one transnational terror group, but it nonetheless started pumping security assistance into so-called ungoverned or undergoverned spaces where terrorism might take root. And this focus on counterterrorism was especially great in West Africa, where the United States pumped billions of dollars into the security forces of the region, especially Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. Now, this flood of money into the security sector altered the dynamics of the region, and also it altered individual governments. Lip service and relative pittances went into funding democratic institutions, good governance, vibrant civil society, and instead, the U.S. pumped in arms, trainers, advisors, U.S. commandos who conducted unilateral missions or alongside proxies. The U.S. built a plethora of outposts across the region, including drone bases, and in the process, empowered repressive governments and abusive militaries, which in turn helped to turn local grievances into recruiting tools for terrorists. My experience reporting in the region suggests that the major issues fueling conflict are not actually military in nature. They stem from poverty, the legacy of colonialism, elite corruption, political tensions, poor governance, and most especially abuse by security forces of socially and economically marginalized populations, especially the Fulani, also known as the Pul, who live across the region. And this has helped to fuel terrorism and really make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. These security forces that the U.S. has empowered have been dismal at actually fighting terrorism. If you look back throughout all of Africa, the State Department counted just 9 terrorist attacks in 2002 and 2003, the first years of U.S. counterterrorism assistance to Niger. Last year, attacks in Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali hit almost 2,800. And this is according to the Pentagon. So this is a 30,000% increase. Again, I'm not saying that correlation equals causation, but the numbers should give anyone pause. Now, while fighting terrorism hasn't been a strong suit for America's partners in West Africa, quite obviously, one specialty has emerged, and that's overthrowing governments. And again, I'm not weighing in on causation. Given the massive scale of the training of forces in the Sahel and the massive flood of money into Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, it's probably no surprise that US trained officers have conducted at least 7 coups in those 3 countries since 2012. Before my time here runs out, I wanted to highlight just one key member of the junta in Niger, because I think he is emblematic of what the United States has been doing in the region. It's Brigadier General Moussa Salou Bahmou. He was the chief of Niger's Special Operations Forces prior to the coup, and he's now the chief of defense in the junta. I don't think there's any officer in Niger who had a closer relationship with the United States than Bahmou. Not only did he train at Fort Benning, which is now known as Fort Moore, and the National Defense University, but he had really close and cordial contacts with the United States for many, many years. In the month before the coup, Bahmou met with Lieutenant General John Braga. He's a top U.S. Special Ops commander. They met at the U.S. drone base in Agadez, Niger. Photos show the men embracing, and smiling, and laughing. But all the money that the U.S. poured into Bahmou and his Nigerian special forces didn't seem to have much of an impact last week when the acting Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, showed up in Niger. Bahmou didn't show her much love, despite the longtime support that he's received. He actually threatened to kill the deposed democratically elected president, Mohamed Bazoum, the man that the United States actually trained and funded Bahmou to protect. I think that puts into broad relief the limits of what $500 million in security aid will buy you, and shows the limitations of the U.S. counterterrorism paradigm in the region. And with that, I'll turn things over to my colleagues.
Thanks so much, Nick, and we look forward. Thanks for providing the overview, taking a little bit of a step back, and we'll look forward to engaging in the conversation further on some of the other things you found in some of your reporting and in the region. I next want to ask Sarah Harrison to take up an issue that gets a lot of misunderstanding, I would say is the best way to put it, which is what is sort of the U.S. requirements around security assistance, especially as we talk about coups and whether things are labeled coups. And Sarah is in a really good position to tell us a little bit about this background. Sarah is a senior analyst in the U.S. program at the International Crisis Group with a focus on U.S. military partnerships, security assistance, use of force, and foreign policy in Africa. Before joining the crisis group, Sarah served for more than 4 years as Associate General Counsel at the Department of Defense's Office of General Counsel, where she advised on domestic and international legal issues related to U.S. national security and the activities of U.S. armed forces, including time as the lead attorney for the planning and conduct of Department of Defense activities on the continent of Africa. So Sarah, as a sort of framing question for you, you look closely at the word coup and whether that applies to the takeover in Niger or not, and some of the misunderstandings that have come with whether that term is used and what the U.S. law is around security assistance. So if you could talk us through sort of what it is and where you're seeing the misunderstandings, that would be great. Over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks everyone for joining today. I'm in the US program at Crisis Group. So we look at US foreign policy as it relates to conflict and crises around the world. And my recent report was on US policy in Somalia. And I've written about this coup restriction, which I had to deal with at the Defense Department. And I'll explain why, even though it's a State Department law. So it's been 20 days since the coup happened in Niger, and the US government, the Biden administration, has yet to use the word coup in describing the events that happened. And the reason that there's this hesitancy, and many of you may already know, I'm sure many in the security assistance community who look at coups are joining this call, but it's section 7008. It's referred to as the coup restriction. And that's what I'll refer to it as I talk through it. And it's in the Department of State's Foreign Ops and Related Programs Appropriation Act. It's a appropriations bill that's passed every year for the State Department. It funds the State Department's, all of its assistance programs. So it is not the case, and this is what's wrong in the reporting. You'll see reporters say, if the Biden administration calls it a coup, then all of this assistance is restricted. But that's not the way the law is drafted. There's not some magic word that if the US government says it, then all of a sudden millions of dollars are off the table, right? It's the situation that triggers the law. There's no requirement in the law that the administration make people will say a formal declaration that a coup has occurred. There's no requirement that there's a formal declaration or a certification. This is the trigger. It's situations in which the duly elected head of government is deposed by military coup d'etat or decree, or a coup occurs in which the military played a decisive role in ousting the duly elected head of government. So in the case of Niger, the president, who was a duly elected head of government, even though there were criticisms about the election, was ousted by the military. And so assistance is restricted under section 7008. But I'll explain why there's this like awkward dance that's happening with the way in which the administration is handling how they're labeling this. Just to be clear, not everything that is a coup in kind of layman's terms is a coup under the law or would trigger the restriction. So in Sudan, I'm just going to bring up this example. In October 2021, the coup that happened did not trigger the restrictions under section 708 under the coup restriction because a duly elected leader had not been deposed, and the coup restriction already applied since 1989. So the government didn't call it a coup, and I think it's because they're basically signaling, when they say the word coup, they're kind of signaling that they consider the restriction to apply. And it looks like they're now trying to create this window of diplomacy. It's not really a term of art, it's just something I'm calling it, because they'll talk about this window of opportunity. They're talking about it right now to try to reverse the coup. And when the Burkina Faso coup, the first one in 2022 happened in January, it took the administration from January 23 to February 18th for them to say it was a coup, and formally say that the restriction is now in place. But it's really the facts on the ground that matter. And another thing that I think that coverage is getting wrong is what kind of assistance is restricted. It's not all assistance. The law is very specific about what assistance is restricted, and it's that it can't go to a government. It could go to NGOs, it could go to civilians, but the assistance that is restricted is not allowed to go to governments. And it's the Titles 3 through 6 under the Appropriations Act that are off limits. And this is kind of just the broad restriction. And the reason that the State Department, the US government, is very scared to just say that it's a coup, signaling that the restriction is in place, is because if the restriction really is in place because of the events on the ground, it's really hard to lift the restriction because the requirement is that a democratically elected government has taken office. And so that could take years, if not decades, if a military takes control from the civilian government because they don't want to relinquish that control. And when that happens, when the democratically elected government takes office, then the Secretary of State has to certify to the appropriate congressional committees that the government has taken office, and that certification is published in the Federal Register. And you can see, for example, a recent certification from Mike Pompeo in 2019 of Thailand's coup restriction being lifted because they had, according to the Secretary of State at the time, a democratically elected government had taken office. Now, there's some flexibility in the law, and I'll try to get through this quickly so we can get to Elias, but Congress made sure that things like humanitarian assistance, for example, are not restricted by the coup restriction. And that's under what we call notwithstanding authorities. They're drafted in specific funding streams, notwithstanding authorities. It just means that regardless of any other law, the State Department can use that funding, that type of funding, like humanitarian assistance. There are other things like international narcotics control, anti-terrorism, anti-crime programming. You have to look at the specific funding stream to see if there's a notwithstanding authority. This can get really tricky in fiscal law. But there are these types of carve-outs. There are specific ones for countries like Egypt. After their coup in 2013, Congress inserted a notwithstanding authority in the Egypt appropriation. And then in the text of the coup restriction itself, it reserves assistance for promoting democratic elections or public participation in democratic processes. And then a new addition was added in fiscal year 2023 to support democratic transitions, which is a new and helpful way in which the State Department might be able to support a government that's moving towards having a democratically elected government. And then there's this new waiver. So this really injects a lot more flexibility. And part of the reason that Congress put the waiver in is in the hopes that the executive branch would just be very clear when a coup happens, because they have this ability to use a waiver on a program by program basis. The Secretary of State has to consult with other relevant agencies, and it has to certify to the appropriations committees that it's in the national security interest to use the waiver. And we can talk more about the waiver in this conversation, but there's flexibility in the law, right? Like now there's more flexibility, like the executive branch could say the word coup. They, in instances, they cannot call it a coup and the law could still apply, like in the case of Egypt, they never called it a coup, but the law still is applicable, right? So there's this weird dance, and I would encourage the executive branch to just be frank, say that a coup has occurred and they're still assessing whether the law is applicable. I think that's a more transparent way of moving forward. And then DoD authorities are implicated in the coup restriction, but we can talk about that later. I see Jeff's turning his video on. But there's just so much to discuss on the coup restriction itself. And I know this is really technical and legal, but it's important for the public to understand and for the media to get it right.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Yeah, it definitely sounds like it gets into some weeds, but it's important to understand that the U.S. does have some obligations here. And maybe when we come back, if you have an understanding of what steps maybe the United States has taken to date, if you do have a sense of that, if it's been transparent, maybe you can add that in. But thanks so much for those clarifications. I'm going to turn last in this first round of questions to Elias Yusuf, who's the research analyst with the Stimson Center's Conventional Defense Program. I work with Elias a lot. His research includes, this isn't the full remit, but it includes the global arms trade, issues related to the use of force and international security cooperation. Prior to joining the Stimson Center, Elias was the deputy director of the Security Assistance Monitor at the Center for International Policy, where he analyzed the impact of U.S. arms transfer and security assistance programs on international security, U.S. foreign policy, and global human rights. And one of the key goals of the Security Assistance Monitor was to provide transparency into the situations where we can have them. So my question for you, Elias, is you closely look at what we can know publicly about training and security assistance, generally finding challenges with the transparency there. Would you detail what some of those challenges have been?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to the other panelists. It's really great to be here, and it's a great question. I think it points to why so much of the scope and depth of U.S. military engagements abroad, especially in places like the Sahel, are so poorly understood or appreciated. So I am going to zoom out a bit, though, and try to talk about this in slightly broader terms. So for more than 2 decades now, as Nick sort of alluded to, security assistance and partner capacity building programs have become the principal way in which the United States engages militarily in other parts of the world, right? Reeling from those large-scale deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, security cooperation is increasingly seen as this really effective means of addressing security threats and confronting adversaries while keeping these conflicts both politically and militarily at arm's length. But despite the centrality of security cooperation in defining the United States' foreign military footprint, information on these programs is often highly classified, deeply obscured, either bureaucratically or through other means, or just not available in a public domain. I'm sure Nick is very familiar with this as a journalist. And this is especially and painfully true for Department of Defense-led programs, including the Consolidated Train and Equip Program, Section 333 of Title 10, as it's commonly known, or its even more secretive 127 ECHO program, which allows the department to furnish local, state, and non-state actors with money and material in support of U.S. counterterror missions. So to put this into context, while I know we are all anecdotally aware of U.S. military involvement and security cooperation initiatives in the Sahel, notwithstanding any government observers that may be in the audience, I doubt anyone in this virtual room could speak with any meaningful confidence about the overall scale or contours of those efforts, right? Data on military hardware or arms provided to Sahelian security forces is not publicly available. Information on the sorts of counterterror operations involving local partners is frequently classified. And I mean, even the dollar figure in an aggregate amount that the US taxpayer has provided individually to militaries across the region is largely unknown. Now, we get little glimpses of some of this through budget documents, congressional reports, sometimes GAO reports, but it's not provided in some way that might be meaningfully accessible to the public or help inform public debate. And as you can imagine, this sort of secrecy, it has consequences. In the first place, it can provide the sort of smokescreen that facilitates, whether deliberately or unintentionally, mission creep that entangles the United States in conflicts without enough public debate or scrutiny. And the Sahel is a prime example of this phenomenon, where these advise and assist programs have mixed with other authorities to create, in effect, pseudo-combat operations, right? Placing US personnel in environments where hostilities are exceedingly likely, despite being outside the scope of their initial missions or remits. Also, a lack of transparency allows the United States, and this sort of speaks to Sarah's point, to chart a sort of equivocating path in the aftermath of military coups or other such predatory behaviors on the part of security partners. All too frequently, we've seen a disconnect between these very powerful rhetorical condemnations from Washington and security cooperation activities on the ground, right? By obscuring public, and I should also mention congressional oversight, the United States is able to sustain, in many cases, some level of security assistance activities, even after dramatic events like the one that we witnessed in Niger last month. And lastly, and I, kind of a more nuanced point here, but I think the lack of transparency undermines efforts to gain a more holistic understanding of how military assistance programs are shaping environments in which they're being implemented. I think many of us will agree that civil society organizations, be that think tanks, academic institutions, human rights researchers, journalists, all provide this really invaluable service through their research and insights to help inform evidence-based approaches to policies. But when you secret this information away, we lose the opportunity to engage a wider array of voices and experts who can contribute to more rigorous interdisciplinary assessments of these programs, their efficacy in achieving foreign policy ends, and how they impact not just local security, that's a very narrow lens, but broader political economies as well. And I think there is quite an impact. One might wonder, for example, how empowering certain military actors in a place with unsettled security governance and uneasy civil-military relations might affect democratization efforts. And so without that sort of transparency-enabled research and insights, I think we're going to struggle to align military assistance programming with those larger foreign policy goals. And I think we're going to continue to find ourselves entangled in, with foreign security partners whose behaviors and activities belie US interests or the ideals that the United States is supposedly meant to stand for. So I tried to keep it very short there. Jeff, I'm going to hand back over to you and look forward to the next round of questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Elias. I mean, I certainly struggle to get information, and people who are charged with doing that are struggling as well. So it's good to have a feel for that. And as you say, a great deal of the United States effort around the world is around security assistance rather than sort of direct transfer of sold weapons. In the second round here, and folks, please do feel free to put questions in the Q&A. I see there's one now. I haven't gotten a chance to look at it. And when we get to the Q&A round, if people want to ask a question, they can raise their hand. I can probably unmute you. But now we're going to turn the conversation, and we're already sort of doing this, as to how to do better moving forward. What wasn't considered in all the security assistance that has happened to Niger in the past or other countries in the region? How can we do better? So we can call this recommendations or lessons learned, but the basic thrust of the next portion here is, how can we do better moving forward? Based on the problems you have all described, what do you recommend be done moving ahead? And we'll turn it over to you first, Nick.
Thank you. I'm going to keep this pretty brief because I am but a lowly journalist. So policy prescriptions are they're well above my pay grade. I'm going to leave that to my colleagues on this panel. But I would say that my reporting suggests that more study, more analyses, more investigation, and dare I say a reevaluation might be needed. I want to highlight that the Pentagon preemptively announced that there's no correlation between their training and coups. And when I asked for the basis of that assertion, a spokesperson responded, there's no correlation between their training and coups. This isn't really helpful. I don't think it's helpful to the Pentagon. I don't think it's helpful to their African partners. After 20 plus years of employing the same counterterrorism paradigm, spending billions of US taxpayer dollars, only to see terror attacks in the Sahel go through the roof, along with civilian fatalities. And along with all of this, a proliferation of US trained coup leaders. I think that, I'd say perhaps, just perhaps, a reevaluation is warranted. And with that, I'll turn it back over.
Thanks, Nick. Sarah, how about some thoughts from you? I think you and I have talked about sort of what has gone into some of these decisions, and you've raised some questions there, but whatever you want to talk about here first in terms of sort of things to do moving ahead.
Am I frozen?
No, you're good.
Okay,
No, we can hear you. There you are.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I looked frozen on my end. So I guess I just want to emphasize that from my perspective, like Nick said, US security assistance and training doesn't lead to coups. The US actually trains to not do these kinds of things. And if you look at some of Crisis Group's writing where I work, our West Africa director has a great article on the domestic circumstances that led to coups in Guinea and Mali and Burkina, that all have to do with a multitude of mostly institutional failures, like corruption or insecurity, predatory actions by the government against dissidents. But I encourage people to go and read that. But I do think that there are important ways to think about and be critical of US security assistance when it might be ignoring the context in which it's being provided. And one way that the US government might proceed is to do risk analysis of whether there's potential for coups and whether it makes sense to continue to provide security assistance in those places of instability and risk. In Niger, there had been 2 recent coup attempts. So I can't understand why. There was an article yesterday about the US being blindsided by this coup. How is that possible when there had been 2 recent attempts in Niger, and they've seen coups occur in the region and have been surprised by those as well. So I think that having a little more humility about understanding the local context in which the US is providing such immense amounts of security assistance and humanitarian aid. And then Dan Mahanti wrote these great thoughts on Twitter. I just thought I'd share. He's a civilian protection expert, and I totally agree with him on these questions because these are common themes I know Elias sees in his research. And one is that the claims of US security assistance has some kind of transformational, democratizing effect, is how Dan put it, on foreign security institutions. I heard this a lot from, and I still hear it a lot from US officials, that it's really critical to providing assistance because of that influence. And I think that's something that the US needs to think about. And the need for, and reflect on, like, does security assistance actually lead to transformational democratic changes? And then the need for prerequisites before security assistance is provided, like potentially a risk analysis or other types of assurances. And then the promise that US security assistance or its deprivation is going to somehow have significant political incentives. And the response from the general when Deputy Secretary Newland spoke with him in Miami was, if the US is going to withdraw its security assistance, and so be it if that's the cost of our sovereignty. So I think the US needs to do a critical analysis of its security assistance programming and the context in which it's being provided. For answers in the region, I would encourage everyone to look at our crisis group products on the Sahel. We have a report recently on France's stabilization efforts there, and really emphasizing that there should be a prioritization to address the region's governance crisis and have the military effort be subordinate or serve that effort. And the same from our crisis group president, who spoke on CNN after the coup in Niger, that the hard work of rebuilding institutions is not replaced by immense amounts of security assistance to the region. But I'll stop there. I think there's a lot of really great writing from people like Howard French and Ken Opolo on thinking through the local context and the history and what next.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Folks, still feel free to keep adding more questions or to upvote the questions that we have here. Elias, some of your thoughts, and then after Elias goes, I'll ask the other panelists if they have reactions to each other, and then we'll open it up broadly to the Q&A. Elias.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief here. First of all, I just want to reiterate both points that Sarah and Nick made, and that is that there really needs to be better assessments of what the consequences and impacts of U.S. security cooperation activities are. And it may be true that there isn't sort of some kind of direct causal relationship between, a training program and then creating a coup leader. But a lot of my research has looked at how security cooperation can shape over many years political economies of recipient states, and it certainly does have an impact. And you can imagine how the infusion of military hardware, capabilities, but also political elevation of certain individuals in unsettled security contexts can shape things like governance and civil military affairs. So that's one. I know people come to me for the transparency stuff, so I can make this very simple and easy. When it comes to transparency, I think there are some fairly manageable but concrete changes that can be made. And first and foremost is we need detailed yearly reporting on U.S. security cooperation activities, especially for the Department of Defense. So what does this look like? An annual report, for example, on Title X authorities with specific country amounts, so how much was given to each country over the course of the last fiscal year. Ideally, this would include things like this types of assistance, maybe the kinds of hardware. It sounds like a lot, but we know that this is possible. I mean, I remember looking at the Afghan Security Forces Fund budget documents in the past, and there was very detailed reporting down to the number of small arms being provided. So, maybe there are accommodations that can be made, but we really need to get a better sense of the depth and nature of the relationships the United States is sustaining in not just the Sahel, but beyond. I think the other thing is, and I'm starting to sound like a broken record on this, I think we've all heard some of the familiar concerns around Russia or China sweeping in the aftermath of a U.S. decision to end security cooperation. I think that actually points to a much bigger problem with our military assistance, which I think Sarah was sort of alluding to, and that is, if these countries are so quick to turn to America's peer competitors for their defense needs in the aftermath of a suspension or some sort of imposition of conditions, I think it suggests that we are not building the sort of durable, meaningful relationships that we sometimes claim to be doing, and that we are just fundamentally misaligned in our interests with the political elites of these places. And if that's the case, I wonder if it reflects on the wisdom of providing them with greater and greater military capability. To me, it does not necessarily inspire confidence. And so I think that it suggests that we really need to rethink the mentality around this if we're not there, China or Russia will be there. And I think it distorts our strategic calculus. And I think it inflates the supposed risks of curtailing or suspending assistance, and entirely ignores the potential dividends the United States might accrue from being more, to having greater discretion in selecting our security partners and distancing ourselves from irresponsible or predatory security actors. I could go into sort of my desire to see more robust and interdisciplinary pre-assessments that Sarah talked about, or just better evaluation of security cooperation, but I think I'll leave that to the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Elias. And if all the panelists want to go ahead and turn their videos on now, does anybody have a reaction to each other that they want to jump in here? And while you're thinking about that, you all can see that we only have 3 questions right now. So if there's one in there you particularly want to tackle, you can let me know when we get to the open Q&A. But Nick, I see you've unmuted. I don't know if you had a reaction or thought on something Sarah or Elias had said. No, okay. Sarah, did you have any add on to what Elias might have said there?
Yeah, I just completely agree with him. I also think it's counterproductive, especially in Africa. Like, you hear from government leaders saying they don't want to be a pawn in this great power competition game. And so framing US objectives on the continent as great power competition objectives, or just hard security, it doesn't really focus on like what African countries want and what their people want, and addressing their concerns for how they want to move forward, or what they want their sovereignty to look like. So I do think it actually undermines the US when they frame it that way, when they're trying to build these actual sustainable and durable relationships. And you know, a laudable attempt by the Biden administration to put forward an international infrastructure fund in their, I think this was in their budget proposal before, but it's in their supplemental funding proposal that they just submitted to Congress. And the justification for it is to counter China. It's not necessarily to like build strong economic partners and help their countries grow, right? And I think that sort of framing is so short-sighted, and it's so unfortunate, because it would actually get the US in a better position in the partnership to frame it in a way of being beneficial to the partner, not you know, part of this competition with China and Russia. So yeah, I totally agree with what Elias is saying there about security assistance.
Yeah, and just to build on that, Jeff, you know, I think part of what Sarah's getting at here is that the United States often conflates its security cooperation with the country generally. And of course, that's not the case. This is about relationships with a very narrow set of actors that don't necessarily have the broader interests of the state or the people at heart. And this is true beyond the Sahel, obviously, and beyond Niger. And so I think this hyper focus on security sector assistance, and even the coverage over the last few days about the US response, has focused on whether or not we're going to end security assistance. I think it really speaks to the lack of understanding of the local context, the lack of appreciation that there is different sectors of society that are either benefiting or being damaged by the behavior of state actors. And so we really should expand our aperture beyond narrow security cooperation to think about bigger bilateral relationships and what the aims should be, not just for, you know, counterterrorism, but more broadly for our partners.
And if I can also add to that, I think this is like, it's like a structural problem with how the US relies on security assistance and security cooperation to build partnerships. It's like, it's such a big part of the partnership, right? And I think that's so unfortunate that if it's the case that security assistance is cut off and there the partnership falls apart, well then, like Elias is saying, it's like not a very strong bilateral relationship, right? Like it shouldn't be dependent on this military relationship or sending lethal equipment or other type of military equipment or providing training. Like the fact that people are advocating for our military to do diplomatic engagement with Niger now, because that's who has the strongest relationship with, you know, the junta, I think it's a tell, right? That like this is, there's a bigger issue with how the US develops these relationships. And I think it's up to Congress to think about, if they actually want to compete, what does that mean? And like, you know, maybe more economic assistance is the answer. I don't know. I can't put that forward because I haven't done enough research on it. But like, there is a problem with the fact that this is how the U.S. government is building its relationships, and it's so critical to the relationship.
Well, great. I'm looking at the questions here. I don't know if there's one in here that any of the panelists want to jump in on. I'll give a second to see if you've had a chance to look and want to take one on. Otherwise, I will reframe and see if anybody wants to start.
I mean, I can start with the question that sorry, I just see the one from Mark M, his first question at 129. You know, I haven't
Can you
done
reframe the question just for the recording?
Yeah, sorry. You know, what lessons are drawn from measuring the correlation of U.S. trained officers and their potential for launching coups? And is the measurement even relevant considering the majority of coups are occurring in Francophone African states, each with embedded histories of coups pre-post 9/11 military engagement? So I think, you know, in my mind, you know, it would take a lot of research to look at causality and correlation. There has been some research to this effect. There is some data out there. There have been questions raised about, is the data good? How can you, you know, maybe there's a data selection problem, right? The U.S. is engaging in security assistance in places where coups are more likely, whatever the case may be. I think what it speaks to is that there isn't necessarily a lot of discretion in who the United States selects to be trained in the United States. I mean, I think according to the data that I saw from the Security Assistance Monitor, it's something like 70,000 troops or 70,000 trainees between Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mauritania, and I think maybe one other one, 70,000 some troops trained. That's a huge number. And of course, in that context, it's not surprising if there's a place that has a history of coups, a very unsettled civil military relations, that the United States is going to be providing assistance to officers that will eventually be engaged in these sorts of activities. So rather than saying, you know, worrying about causality in this moment, I'm very concerned about, can we just do a better job of being more thoughtful about who we select for this? Can we be more discreet? Can we be better at those pre-assessments that Sarah talked about? I mean, there is plenty of data and research that should be going into those pre-assessments, that not just, you know, hey, do we think this partner security force can translate this assistance into a capability? There needs to be political science dedicated to assessing who should and shouldn't be receiving that assistance.
I just wanted to tack on one thing there. You know, I think Elias is right on the money with you know, being more selective and more thoughtful. A few years back, maybe it's more like 6 or 7 years back, I was part of an investigation where we looked at security assistance globally and sort of the vetting of who this training was going out to. And you know, there's Leahy vetting that's done, so you can see the human rights record, but the vetting, because we used WikiLeaks cables, you could see how quickly it was done. And at that time, it was about 1 to 2 minutes of vetting per each partner. I mean, it's almost impossible. I mean, I guess you can get maybe a Google search started and look at you know, the things that come up on the first screen, and that's about it. So, I mean, the selectivity has never been a big part of this process. There was one question I thought I might be able to weigh in on a little bit, you know, that Connor raised. The U.S. currently has around 1,000 soldiers in Niger who work on counterterrorism operations in the region. How do you expect the Pentagon to respond to the ongoing crisis? Under what circumstances would U.S. troops have to withdraw, and how would that affect U.S. operations in the region? I think for most of those questions, you know, I don't have a good answer, and maybe Sarah has better insights than I do on this. But just to provide a little bit of context, you know, those 1,000 soldiers, the large number of them are at a U.S. drone base in Agadez, in the northern central part of the country, and this is you know, the U.S. refuses to call this a base. They claim to only have one base on the African continent, Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, but I've been on the outskirts of this base and I've flown over it. I mean, it's a huge complex. You know, there's also a major training effort going on at an outpost called Wallam, the town of Wallam in Niger. There's also a CIA base in Arlit. So, I mean, there's a major security presence, and I've been asking the Pentagon the same questions that Connor's asking here. Under what circumstances do U.S. troops have to withdraw? You know, now they're sequestered on these bases, and they don't seem to want to answer this question. They are avoiding it, parrying it, you know, and they seem not to want to call this a coup. You know, back to what Sarah was talking about before, as if that has some bearing on the matter. But you know, there are real reasons why I think the Pentagon doesn't want to really address this. That base at Agadas that I mentioned, it cost $110 million to build. The Pentagon pumps in about $30 million every year to keep it up and running. I mean, it's a major operation, and it's really been the bulwark, you know, the linchpin of security operations regionally. So it's a major loss if they have to give this up. So I can provide a little bit of background there and just let you know that that DoD doesn't want to talk about it.
Yeah,
Sarah, and thanks for jumping in. I was going to call on you. And I think maybe also there was a little bit of discussion of Leahy, as you think some clarification there might be helpful. But also there's a question here about, that Elise Swain asks about sort of ongoing U.S. responsibility. So I think that might be also a way for you to talk about, well, the law doesn't actually block off XYZ types of engagement. So you talked about it when you were talking about the law, but if you have thoughts on what just happened, as well as sort of how the U.S. could stay engaged in other ways, that would be great.
Yeah, I just, someone said don't reveal where U.S. forces are in the region. The things that Nick was talking about are very public. The New York Times has reported on this, as well as other major publications. So I don't think he's revealing anything that's unknown. But so the coup restriction, first of all, doesn't restrict U.S. operations or presence. So DoD can still, like, that's why the forces are still there, right? Like, they are not prohibited from being present in a country because of the coup restriction. The reason that DoD says that the only base on the continent is in Djibouti is because it's its only permanent base. It's just like, it's the lingo in which they use. And so the permanent basing is in Djibouti, and there are other places around the continent where they operate that are not considered permanent. And so how are they going to respond? I agree with Nick that they see this as an important, I mean, people talk about, right, like the Defense Department will talk about this as like a cornerstone of their counterterrorism efforts in the Sahel. It's where they operate ISR aircraft in the region to collect intelligence. Under what circumstances would they have to withdraw? I would imagine if an ECOWAS invasion happened and there was a regional war, I think that would really put the Defense Department in a tricky position to have to probably leave just for force protection issues. And I think that if this coup isn't reversed, which I think the State Department continues to think it will be, but as of this coming Saturday, it will be the same time frame that we saw in Burkina, at which point they called it a coup. I think Saturday or next week, it's sometime very soon, but I think that if it's not reversed, it's going to be hard as a policy matter to stay. And you know, the U.S. is there training and equipping Nigerian forces, and a lot of that's going to be off limits. I talked earlier about, I won't get into the wonkiness of it, but there are some authorities, like Elias talked about, the 333 and 331 authorities that are off limits now because of the coup restriction by law. So what is the US going to do there? Are they just going to collect ISR? I don't know. And they can conduct these 127 ECHO programs, as Catherine Ebright has pointed out on Twitter, that she's written about as well. And so have I, but these are like these secret programs where the Defense Department Special Forces will basically, they don't call it assistance, but they basically provide assistance to foreign forces to go out and help. They support SOF's operations. And then how would that affect U.S. operations in the region? Well, they're going to be pretty limited if they leave Niger, right? Because of the coup in Mali and the coup in Burkina. What else am I missing, Jeff? Those are my thoughts about those questions. It's kind of fluid.
I don't know if
right
you
now.
wanted to sort of weigh in on, Elias was talking about, and Nick as well, about the vetting of forces. And, I think in the public, the Leahy law, everyone, if they've heard anything about US restrictions, they've heard of Leahy law, but it's often misunderstood. I don't know if you want to quickly clarify like the contributions that Leahy law does actually make to this, but where the limitations might be in it would also be great.
Yeah, the Leahy law is very specific to units of foreign security forces. So the coup restriction, it's a broad restriction on lots of different funding streams. The Leahy law restricts security assistance to units of foreign security forces, or it's not even just security assistance, any assistance that goes to units of foreign security forces that State Department and DoD have credible information committed a gross violation of human rights. These are the worst crimes you could see, right? Like an extrajudicial killing, torture, rape, things like that. And so there's two different laws and they restrict that assistance. And the way that they're implemented is by vetting, that's what they're talking about, vetting these units to see if they have a history of committing a gross violation of human rights. And so that's important for not giving assistance to units that go out and commit these really terrible violations. It doesn't prevent them from committing it, right? The US could provide assistance and then subsequent to that, a unit could commit those crimes, but it's indicative of a pattern if they've done it in the past. And so the US doesn't give assistance if they know they've done it under this law. There's flexibility in the law if they hold the perpetrators to account. But it's very different from the coup restriction and it gets at different issues, right? One is a human rights issue and one is a democracy or their values, right? US values of human rights and democracy that we're injecting. And I also think this is like an important point to make for everyone is that like, there are these different kinds of restrictions on security assistance because Congress is trying to institutionalize values on policymakers that otherwise pursue expedient policies and short-term gains because they're trying to pursue that bilateral or multilateral relationship. And what Congress does when it imposes these institutional values, it's looking at the long term, right? Not the short term. And so I think that these kinds of laws are really important and maintaining their strength is important because I think otherwise policymakers would just give military equipment to the junta in Burkina, which is what they're trying to do right now through the waiver. Yeah, I don't know if we've talked about that yet.
Sadly, we're at the last 3 minutes. So thanks so much, Sarah and Nick and Elias. I want to give the panelists a chance if they have any final thoughts. We have a lot of good questions we didn't get to, and an interesting one that just came in at the very end from Jeff Selden about, which I think is I won't read the question, but the idea that there are many factors that lead to these coups, which I think we've all sort of recognized that this is a very complex situation and it's hard to predict, but that's, I think, why so many of the panelists are calling for better assessment at the beginning. Just want to give Nick, Sarah, and Elias, if they have any final comments on lessons to learn or thoughts here before we close out. I'll just turn it over to each of you if you have anything else you'd like to add.
I can just, so thanks, Jeff, this is great. No final thoughts beyond to say that I think many of the questions that we saw here, including the last one that came in, speak to why transparency is so terribly needed. I would love to be able to research some of the questions that we saw here, do a better job of getting a handle on some of these questions, add some of that political science knowledge to the enterprise, but without transparency it becomes very, very difficult. And so if I can have one final plug for transparency, I think I'm happy to end on that.
Yeah, I don't really have any final thoughts other than to just thank you for putting together this panel. I thought the questions were great. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to any more of them, but love to keep the conversation going. So thank you. Thanks for the forum.
Yeah, and I agree with the criticism of not having an African perspective on the panel. We were just trying to look at U.S. security assistance and even globally how this works. And but I totally hear that, and we threw this together in a few days. But next time, yeah. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Well, thank you, Elias, Nick, and Sarah, for this. Yeah, and as Sarah's alluding to, it's a super complicated issue. There are many voices and many more voices that we hope will be heard. And there will be lots of events happening in the coming days and weeks, obviously, maybe not from the forum, but from other partners in the community. But there's lots of lessons learned and there's lots of challenges, and there's not always a clear answer. But hopefully there's been some ideas that our panelists have provoked. In the follow-up to this, this video is available and it's public. We'll send around some notes, including some recommended resources and potential thoughts that came out of this call. I'll remind folks that the Forum on the Arms Trade itself doesn't take positions. This is what we try to do, is we try to bring experts together, talk about and present ideas on topics, which I really want to thank the three panelists for doing so. As Sarah mentioned, we did this a little bit rather quickly. I think the idea of the panel is just over a week old, and there will be others. But as you leave, thanks. Please do take the poll that you will be shown to, so we get some insights on what you thought worked, what we could do better in the future. And with that, I want to thank all of our panelists and all of our participants for joining in and for their questions. Thanks so much.